Beep beep. What is up, ninjas? My name is SemWorld. Today I didn't have an idea on what kind of tutorial I wanted to make, so I decided to go on Reddit to find some questions. And one of the questions that was asked 12 days ago was, need help with sub bass, 3 upvotes. Hi guys, I've heard that Latmun uses just a sine wave bass in his track Everybody's Dancing and possibly Jamie Jones blah blah blah. Trying to do the same, but with no luck. Even with a saturator on there, I can't achieve the same results. Can barely even hear it. Any advice? So we're going to be answering that question. Now we're going to be using 2 tracks to do this. The first one is going to be the General from Mark Knight, or El General, the way it should be called. And then we're going to have Everybody's Dancing by Latmun, which is the question the guide asked. So here we're going to have this. Okay, if I go over here, this is the original. So as you can hear, pretty close. Mine's is lacking a little bit more dirt to it, but we are going to be talking about how you're going to be adding that and all that good stuff. What I've done here, guys, is I've gotten pretty much the intro of each song to just go ahead and make this example, so we only focus on the sub bass. Now let's assume you do this yourself and you find that your sub bass sounds fine, but when you play with your own drums it doesn't work. Well, you might want to try and change out the kick as well. Now the next example we're going to have is the General, which our example is going to be the original one. Sounds like this. So as you heard, these examples are super close to the original counterparts. The sub bass are almost there. And a lot of it has to deal a lot with the mastering as well, guys. Keep in mind that this sub bass is not being routed into a master channel or the master channel they did. But today we're going to be using these examples to teach you how to get your sub bass right. Finally kill all these doubts you might have in your head when it comes to it and misinformation about it. Now before we get started, guys, if you want to support my channel, make sure to head over to evilsounds.com. That's where you're going to find a lot of my sound design work. And with that being said, let's get straight into this. Now, the first example here, you can see the preset name is Sine Wave from Deceiver. I've modified it a bit. But if you hear it, okay, it sounds pretty good. You might say, if I asked you the question, yo, what do you think this wavetable is? Is it a sine, triangle, saw, square? Name it. Most people would go with a sine. And while it does sound like a sine, it's not a sine. So the first misconception is that you gotta stop thinking that everyone that has a track with like a bass that is just boom, 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 boom is utilizing a sine wave. That sine wave is not the only choice. You can definitely grab a sine, distort it to give it more harmonics, but it's not always a sine. In fact, this is gonna be a saw and a square. The saw is gonna be at -2, the square at 3. Now, you might be going, okay, cool, so it sounds like the sine. Why don't I just go with the sine? Well, if we go back to the question we have on Reddit, he says can barely even hear it. I don't know if he means that he can barely hear that sine wave, or if he can barely hear the sub bass, or if he can hear how close it is. I'm going to assume he can't hear the sub. And the reason for that is that when we go with a sine wave, the sine wave is one of the purest waveforms that you're ever going to have. Now, the first thing we must explain, guys, is the sine wave. The sine wave is going to be the virgin out of all the wavetables, all the analog wavetables. What I mean by that is that the square wave is going to be the good-looking guy in the group, while the sine is probably going to be the nice guy, the okay-looking guy that doesn't go for it. However, that's a good thing because you can shape it to however you want. You know, you can marry it. So when we have a sine that played in D, you can barely hear it, and of course, you have the fundamental frequency there. If I move it around, you're only going to have that. Now, there's this place called Sine Heaven, as I like to call it, and Sine Heaven is going to be G and up, the keys of G and up. The reason for that is that you can actually hear it, and it's at its strongest. If I go to Sine Hell, which is down F and under, F is still good, but now we reach Hell. You can barely hear that sine wave. So going back to that question, if you have a track in the key of D, it doesn't make sense to go with a sine wave. It makes more sense to go with a square. Now, if we hear a square and it's all glory in D, you can actually hear a lot. Now, let's assume we want to get rid of some of those upper harmonics and we play it in D. You can still hear it. On account of a sine wave, again, it's in hell. A square wave, it's not at its greatest, at its strongest, but you can still hear it because of the upper harmonics that it has. So that's why I don't want you guys to always assume that a sub bass that someone's using is a sine wave. It could definitely be a sine wave, but it doesn't have to be. The next thing that I want you guys to realize too is this RM phase that you tend to find in these synthesizers. If this RM phase is up in serum, that means that we don't have any retrig. So that means that I am allowed to start anywhere I please with the phase, and it's going to start randomly at anywhere here. Now, the problem with this is that if I hit that D a lot, you might hear some inconsistencies in the way that it sounds like, because again, the phase is allowed to start anywhere. Now, if I lower this RM phase down, it's always going to sound the same when it hits. So that's another thing that you want to set yourself up for. That RM phase, usually when you're making mono bass sounds, you want to keep it down at 0%, and that's what will be considered a retrig. Okay, simple as that. Now, the other thing, too, that I like to tell people to do when they're making these kind of sub basses is to add an upper layer. Now, in this example, in this question, someone did give an example of where they made a similar sound where they utilized 2 sine waves, both down 12 semitones, which is an octave, which doesn't make any sense to me. One would have been fine. And then a triangle wave set to 0, which means it's up an octave. That is actually a really good tip. A lot of times, if you have a layer of another, let's say a saw here, you're going to give that a lot more power when you're in the lower octaves, like in D. Now, if you move to G, now if I get rid of the saw, it doesn't do much there. But once we start going down into D territory, you can see the big difference that it makes. So if you're going to be making tracks in low keys like D, E, F, and so forth, or not F, but like D sharp in those, do try and back yourself up with this. Now, there is an exception to this rule, and this is how we come to this song, Everybody's Dancing, which has that exception. Now, ideally, Ableton said that this was in the key of C minor or C major. Now, if we look at the MIDI of this, if we're playing at the core of this sound super low, it would be like this. However, in this track, we have a sine wave that's not playing at the lowest octave it can reach, but it's actually playing an octave higher. So we got that high E4. The 3 is going to be the sweet spot for our bass. However, what Latmun decides to do in this track is that he pitches that up an octave, so you can actually hear it. Now, when we go and hit that A at the bottom, that A actually is going to sound good because it's in sine heaven. This is high as fuck, so it's in sine heaven. However, sometimes playing their sub up, it can sound too resonating, so you have to learn when to implement that. But that's another thing you can do with your sub basses, is that if you find they're not punching through and you're in a low key, then you might choose to go with something that is an octave higher, as long as, again, you're still hitting some of the sweet spots, okay? So going back to making this sub bass, the sub bass is actually going to be a sine wave in all reality. You can also go with a triangle on it, which sounds just as good. The triangle wave is going to be not the alpha of the group, but it's going to have definitely some upper harmonics. It's kind of like a sine wave that got a little bit distorted. We have these harmonics added here. It's sort of like when you distort a sine wave enough, you turn it into a square. Here, it's at the midway point. It's going to be the alpha of the group, but it's not there yet. So hopefully my analogies are making sense, and hopefully you're understanding why it's wrong to always assume that a sine wave is your desired sub bass. Now, if we go in here and just recreate this sound, let's assume that I want to do this the way I had it with a square. That is totally fine. So we're going to go with a square. We're going to add that saw up -2. We're going to put a filter here, MG low 24, to allow less highs. A bit of drop. Okay. Last trick that I have for you guys before we move on to the next example is that you always want to have a compressor on these style of sub basses. The reason for that is that if you're moving around a lot, you're going to see that the volume tends to move around. And for a mixing engineer, or if you're mixing this yourself, this could get kind of annoying, especially when you hit those top notes. So always compress your sub bass. You don't have to have a high attack on it, because you're not trying to preserve anything punchy. The sub bass is just boom, 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 boom. There's no dynamics to it already, but when it does start to switch in volume, that can cause issues. So that's where a compressor can come into play. Just a little bit of tame it. Now, if you go between both, you can see mine has a bit too much upper harmonics, so that's why it sounds a little bit like. So if you want to get that deep vibe, we're just going to have to lower this EQ down a bit more. Now from there, you can choose to distort if that's what you. And as you can see, as long as we have that EQ set there, it's not going to mess anything up. It's all in that, guys, and the compressor. Now, the last thing I do have the bottom right, I always forget to explain this part, is the mono legato always on. Mono legato is going to allow your bass to essentially glide between notes. Here we have it set to always, so that every time we switch notes, it glides. It doesn't have to, you don't have to have the MIDI notes overlapping like when you have the always off, okay? Now on to the next example, guys. We're going to go to the big man, big boy Mark Knight with El General. It's a cool song, and our recreation sounds like this. Okay, so this one is another neat one, and in this one we're not going with the square and saw. In fact, we're just going with a sine wave. The issue is that the distortion or the saturation, whatever you decide to do to get it to sound this way, is going to be the key to it. A sine wave by itself is going to sound like this. However, with some distortion, we start adding those upper harmonics to it, because as we do distortion, distortion is a heavy form of saturation. With saturation, you're adding upper harmonics to a sound. So here we're using this heavy distortion to get it to where it needs to be. Now you can switch between. Each distortion is going to add it in a different way, and it's up to you to decide which one you like. The key thing you got to keep in mind here is that we do have this EQA to get rid of some of the upper. So if we go with that, now the original sounds like. So there's this thing about that bass that I couldn't get right, but I know what he's actually doing. It's just very hard to kind of replicate certain pitch bends or certain sweeps that are happening in this song. So I'm going to show you guys this cool little thing that you can do with your sub basses as well. Now the MIDI for this track looks something like this. If I get rid of, so the MIDI for the track looks something like this. If I get rid of this F, which is the key, it sounds like this, which is kind of boring. So this little F is adding this sort of jump upbeat. Now here you can do two of things. You can, one, go into Ableton's MIDI control pitch bend and try and make it yourself, which would sound something like. That's going to give it that nice little jump. From there, you can fine tune. Again, you don't want to go too crazy with. But that key is right here. So you really want that pitch bend. Now, you can apply this in various different ways like that. Or you can do what I did, which is you had that F note up here. And then what you're going to do is you're going to program the synth. And if you're doing it this way, everything is going to be in your bottom right of Serum, which is going to be the mono, the legato, and the always here, the portamento. Always is going to be turned off, so we can actually glide these MIDI notes like that. If you hear the song, the only thing gliding is going to be in this section. This isn't gliding at all. And the way you're going to program that is once you have that set up, you're going to turn your mono legato. and you're going to set that on. From there, you're going to increase the portamento time until you get your desired pitch bend or glide. So essentially, this is telling us how much time it's going to take for us to go from that low G up to that high F. Instant. So with this, you can fine tune that. So that way, if you decide, let's say, I want to do it again, and I thought it sounded fucking dope. This is going to make the notes sound a little bit more goofier because they're not exactly on note on that key after we hit that halfway mark. That is going to be the key to creating these style of bass lines. If you ever hear a bass in a song that's like, it's all going to be here. So if I wanted to, I could do something like this where I have that G all the way through and I can have create really cool kind of like little basses like that. So we could do here. So let's say I want this to actually have the, I can start to lower this down, as you guys know. That's how you create those kind of bass lines. If you want it to always do, you can set it to always and just have the notes moving with each other. But the key is that a lot of the times what I find is these guys have that always off, and that is how we achieve that tech house sub bass whenever you hear those kind of movements to it. Now, in recap, what you guys saw is that the sine wave doesn't always need to, the sub bass doesn't always need to be a sine wave. Just because they both start with the same letter doesn't mean that it's the right way to go. Depending on the key of your track, if you're going down to sine hell, you might want to go with a square and saw. If you're going up more, then you can actually go with a sine. The key thing is for you to realize that and be able to decide when you are working on your track if you want to go for the sine, the pure one, or if you want to shape the sine to sound good down there, and vice versa. That is the key to the tech house sub bass, and that is how you're going to be able to achieve these kind of things. Now, let's assume you do the same thing I did, and then you try and play the sub bass with your own kick. If it doesn't sound the same, if it doesn't sound there, then the problem is going to be the kick, not the sub bass, and that is another issue that comes up. But with this tutorial, my hope is that you guys understand the sub bass, you understand how to set it up, and you understand that there's more possibilities than just utilizing the sine wave. With that being said, guys, I am going to end the video here. Hopefully this shines some light on certain things for you. And if you guys have any more questions like this, leave them down in the comments below, guys, so I don't have to go on Reddit and answer other people's questions, but instead I can answer your questions, the community's questions. With that being said, you want to support my channel, make sure to head over to evilsounds.com. Deceiver is going to be the new tech house pack. Not to make this kind of tech house, but more of the Fisher, Chris Lake kind. But check it out. Worth a listen, guys, and support the channel if you can. I'll catch you guys next time. Take care and peace out.